A 9-year-old boy with bruised hands carries his unconscious 6-year-old sister 4 miles to the nearest hospital through a snowstorm. When doctors ask how she got those injuries, his whispered confession about their stepfather's discipline sessions makes them immediately call 911. The wind rattled the thin walls of the trailer like an angry beast trying to get inside, each gust threatening to tear the entire structure from its cinderblock foundation. 9-year-old Jude Mitchell pressed his ear against the frosted window, watching the snow pile higher against the glass with each passing hour. The weatherman on their crackling television had called it the storm of the decade, but to Jude, it just looked like another reason for Ray to drink. The ice crystals on the inside of the window felt cold against his forehead as he peered through the small, clear spot he had created with his breath. Outside, the world had become a white void, swallowing up the familiar landmarks that marked their small corner of Vermont. The old oak tree that stood 20 feet from their front door was barely visible through the driving snow, its branches bending and swaying like ghostly arms in the wind. The driveway that connected them to Maple Ridge Road had disappeared entirely, under a blanket of white that seemed to grow thicker with every passing minute. "Jude, come away from there," whispered his 6-year-old sister Ivy from her spot on the threadbare couch. Her blonde hair caught the dim light from the single lamp they kept on to save electricity, making her look like an angel in the gloom of their cramped living space. She clutched her worn stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, against her chest, a habit she had developed whenever Ray's voice started to rise above the television or whenever the sound of beer cans opening became too frequent. The trailer they called home sat at the very end of Maple Ridge Road, 4 miles from the center of Millbrook, Vermont. It was a 20 by 8-foot prison that housed too many secrets and not enough warmth, a rectangular box of faded aluminum, siding and rust stains that had been old when their mother first rented it 3 years ago. The brown paneling on the walls had started to peel around the edges years before they moved in, and their mother Carla had given up trying to fix it, after Ray pointed out that they were just renters and any improvements would only benefit the landlord. The kitchen table wobbled on 3 good legs, and one propped up with a stack of phone books that Jude had to readjust every few days. The refrigerator hummed constantly, working overtime to keep their meager groceries cold while fighting against the sub-zero temperature that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice in the trailer's thin walls. The carpet throughout the living area was a dingy brown color that might have once been beige, stained with various substances from previous tenants and current residents alike. The heater, an ancient unit that Ray refused to run at full capacity because of the electric bill, struggled to maintain a temperature that was barely comfortable when wearing multiple layers of clothing. Jude had learned to read the warning signs early in Ray's residency with their family. When Ray's shoulders hunched forward and his hands clenched into fists while watching television, it meant someone had done something wrong and punishment was coming. When his voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that sounded more threatening than any shout, it meant find a hiding place and stay there until the danger passed. When the beer bottles started piling up faster than usual on the kitchen counter, it meant that someone was going to pay for whatever was eating away at Ray's insides that particular day. The signs were all there tonight. Ray had been drinking since late afternoon, starting with the beer he claimed he deserved after another day of unsuccessful job hunting. His shoulders had been tense during dinner, a dinner consisting of canned soup and stale bread that Jude had prepared himself because their mother was already at work. Ray's voice had started dropping to that dangerous register around 7 o'clock, right about the time the storm had begun to intensify outside their windows. "Where's Mama?" Ivy asked, though she already knew the answer. At 6 years old, she understood their family's routine better than most adults understood their jobs. She knew that their mother worked as many hours as possible, that Ray's moods were directly connected to how much alcohol he consumed, and that asking too many questions only made things worse for everyone. "Working," Jude replied, settling down beside her on the couch. The cushions sagged under their combined weight, springs poking through the worn fabric in places where the foam padding had compressed beyond repair. Double shift at Millie's diner. She won't be back until tomorrow morning. Ivy nodded solemnly, her blue eyes reflecting an understanding that no 6-year-old should possess. Their mother Carla worked as many hours as she could get at Millie's diner, the only 24-hour establishment in Millbrook. She served coffee and pie to truckers making overnight runs and locals who worked third shift at the few factories that kept the small town economically viable. The money barely covered rent on the trailer and Ray's drinking habits, but it kept them housed and fed, which was more than they had managed before Ray came into their lives. Carla had met Ray Dunlap at the diner 2 years ago when he was passing through town looking for work and a fresh start. He had been charming then, or at least charming enough to convince a single mother of 2 that any man was better than no man when it came to paying bills and providing stability. Ray had stories about construction jobs in other states, about plans to get back on his feet and build a real life for them all. He had been sober more often than not in those early days, and he had even been kind to Jude and Ivy, bringing them small gifts and treating them like they mattered. But Ray's fresh start had quickly devolved into a series of failed job interviews, unemployment claims, and increasingly frequent visits to Mickey's Tavern downtown. The construction work he had talked about never materialized, partly because Ray's work history was spotty, and partly because his references either no longer had valid phone numbers or actively discouraged potential employers from hiring him. As the rejections piled up and the money ran out, Ray's drinking increased, and his patience with everything and everyone in the trailer decreased proportionally. From the kitchen came the sound of another beer can being opened, followed by Ray's frustrated grunt as he presumably realized he had already finished most of his evening supply. Jude's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. They had learned through painful experience that when Ray ran out of beer, he had 2 options: drive to the store for more, which was dangerous for everyone on the road, or take out his frustration on whatever was closest and most defenseless. Tonight, with the storm raging outside and visibility reduced to nearly 0, driving was not an option, which meant that Ray's frustration would be looking for a different outlet. Ray Dunlap was a thick-set man who stood about 6 feet tall when he bothered to stand up straight, which was becoming increasingly rare as his posture had begun to reflect his general attitude toward life. He had brown hair that was going gray at the temples and permanent stubble that suggested he had given up caring about his appearance around the same time he had given up looking for steady work. His hands always seemed too big for whatever he was holding, whether it was a beer can, a television remote, or one of the children when he was administering what he called discipline. When Ray was sober, which was becoming increasingly rare, he could almost pass for a decent human being. He would tell stories about his younger days when he had worked construction in 3 different states and made enough money to buy a truck and support himself without relying on anyone else. He would talk about his plans to get back on his feet, to find steady work, to maybe move them all to a better place where kids could have their own rooms and backyards to play in. During those brief periods of sobriety, Jude could almost understand what his mother had seen in Ray, what had convinced her to take a chance on a stranger who promised to make their lives better. But sobriety was not Ray's strong suit, and his promises had proven to be as substantial as the smoke from his occasional cigarettes. The man who emerged after 6 or 8 beers was someone entirely different, someone who saw every minor inconvenience as a personal attack and every sound from the children as a deliberate attempt to make his life more difficult. "Tell me about the hospital," Ivy whispered, snuggling closer to Jude on the couch. It was their secret game, one they had developed over the past year during the long hours when their mother was at work, and Ray was either drinking or sleeping off the effects of drinking. Jude would tell Ivy about the route from their trailer to Millbrook General Hospital, describing it like an adventure story rather than the emergency escape plan it actually was. He had memorized every turn, every landmark, every potential shortcut during their previous visits to the emergency room. Visits that their mother always explained away as accidents or childhood clumsiness to anyone who asked too many questions. The game served multiple purposes. It kept Ivy's mind off whatever unpleasantness was happening in the kitchen, It gave them both a sense of control over their situation, and it ensured that both children knew exactly how to get help if they ever needed it when their mother was not around to provide transportation. "Well," Jude began softly, keeping his voice low enough that Ray could not hear from the kitchen. "First, you go down Maple Ridge Road, all the way to the bottom where the fence posts line up like soldiers marching in a straight line. You have to count them as you go. There are exactly 37 posts between our driveway and the main road." Ivy's eyes brightened with the familiar story, her imagination transforming the treacherous winter journey into something magical and adventurous. "And then what happens?" "Then you cross Miller's Creek on the old wooden bridge," Jude continued, painting the picture with words that made it sound like something from a fairy tale rather than a potentially life-threatening trek through a Vermont blizzard. "You know the one. It has that loose board about halfway across that creaks when you step on it, like it's saying hello to everyone who passes over the creek." "I remember," Ivy said softly. "It sounds like a mouse squeaking." "Exactly like a mouse squeaking," Jude agreed. "And if you listen really carefully when you cross that bridge, you can hear the water running underneath, even when it's frozen on top. The creek never stops moving, even in the coldest winter, because it's fed by a spring that comes up from deep underground where it's always warm." This was embellishment on Jude's part. He had no idea about underground springs or the source of Miller's Creek. But Ivy loved the details that made their journey sound magical rather than desperate. And in truth, adding those details helped Jude himself believe that the route was manageable, that if they ever had to make that journey for real, it would be an adventure they could survive rather than a desperate flight that might end in disaster. "And then?" Ivy prompted, though she knew every word of the story by heart. "Then you follow Main Street straight through the heart of town," Jude continued. "Past Miller's Hardware with the big red sign that creaks in the wind. Past the post office with the American flag that's always flying even in the worst weather. Past the Congregational Church with the tall white steeple that you can see from 2 miles away on a clear day. 4 miles total," Ivy recited, as if it were a magic spell that could transport them instantly to safety whenever they needed it. 4 miles exactly, Jude confirmed. "And right at the end of Main Street where the streetlights are brightest and the snowplows always clear the road first, there's Millbrook General Hospital. It's a big brick building with a blue sign that says emergency in letters as tall as you are, and there are always lights on in the windows, even in the middle of the night." They had walked that route with their mother exactly 3 times in the past year, and Jude had memorized every detail during those trips. The first visit had been when Ivy had fallen down the stairs and needed 7 stitches above her left eyebrow, stairs that were actually Ray's fist, connecting with her face when she had spilled juice on his newspaper. The second trip had been when Jude had run into a door and gotten a black eye that lasted 2 weeks and made it difficult for him to see clearly enough to read for days. A door that was actually Ray's elbow when Jude had tried to step between his stepfather and his sister during one of Ray's teaching moments. The third visit had been the most serious. Ivy had slipped in the bathtub and bruised her ribs so badly that she could not take deep breaths for a week and had to sleep sitting up because lying flat was too painful. That particular slip had actually been Ray grabbing her and shaking her so hard that something had cracked in her chest, all because she had been humming while he was trying to watch a football game on television. Each time, their mother had coached them carefully on what to say to the hospital staff. Accidents happened to children all the time. Kids were clumsy and careless. They played too rough and got hurt in ways that looked worse than they actually were. The stories were simple, consistent, and delivered with enough genuine fear that the medical staff generally accepted them without too much additional questioning. But Jude had seen the way some of the nurses looked at them during those visits, particularly the ones who had been working in pediatric care for many years. They had expressions that suggested they suspected more than they were being told, but without proof or admission from the family, there was little they could do beyond treating the immediate injuries and sending the family home with warnings about being more careful in the future. The hospital staff at Millbrook General were kind, especially Dr. Vivian Hayes in the emergency department. She was a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that were gentle even when she was examining painful injuries. Dr. Hayes always seemed to look at their injuries with eyes that saw more than they were supposed to see, asking questions that went just slightly beyond what was necessary for medical treatment. During Ivy's last visit, Dr. Hayes had asked her to draw a picture while they waited for X-ray results. "Draw me your family," she had said, providing Ivy with crayons and paper. The resulting artwork had shown their mother as a large figure. In the center, Ivy and Jude as smaller figures holding hands on one side, and Ray as a dark scribble on the far edge of the paper with angry red marks around him. Dr. Hayes had studied that drawing for a long time before folding it carefully and putting it in Ivy's medical file. She had not asked any direct questions about the angry red marks, but she had looked at their mother with an expression that made it clear she understood exactly what those marks represented. "Jude! Get in here!" Ray's voice boomed from the kitchen, slurred, but still commanding enough to make both children freeze in place. Jude's body tensed automatically, every muscle preparing for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Beside him, Ivy shrank deeper into the couch cushions, making herself as small as possible and hugging Mr. Buttons tighter against her chest. It was a survival skill they had both mastered over the past 2 years, the ability to become nearly invisible when danger was approaching. "Stay here," Jude whispered to his sister, then stood up and walked toward the kitchen with the measured pace of someone approaching a dangerous animal that might bolt or attack depending on how suddenly he moved. Ray stood leaning against the counter, a fresh beer in one hand and an empty pizza box in the other. The pizza had been their dinner, a frozen variety that Jude had cooked in their temperamental oven while their mother was getting ready for work. Ray's dark hair was unwashed and greasy, hanging in his eyes, and his flannel shirt was stained with various substances that Jude did not want to identify. The man's face was flushed red from alcohol and the effort of standing upright, a combination that never ended well for anyone in the trailer. "This place is a pigsty," Ray declared, gesturing around the small kitchen with his beer can in a sweeping motion that sent drops of liquid flying. "Your mother works all day to keep us housed and fed, and this is what she comes home to? Garbage everywhere, dishes piled up in the sink, and you two sitting around like useless lumps watching television." Jude surveyed the kitchen quickly, taking inventory of what Ray was calling a pigsty. There were exactly 3 dishes in the sink, 2 bowls and a spoon from when he had made cereal for himself and Ivy earlier that afternoon. The garbage everywhere consisted of the empty pizza box Ray was holding, 2 beer cans on the counter that Ray himself had emptied, and a paper towel that had fallen to the floor when Jude was cleaning up after dinner. The kitchen was actually cleaner than it had been in weeks, thanks to Jude's efforts to stay ahead of Ray's complaints. He had swept the floor that morning, wiped down the counters after every meal, and made sure all the dishes were washed and put away immediately after use. But pointing out these facts would only escalate the situation and redirect Ray's anger from general complaints to specific targeting of Jude himself. "I can clean it up," Jude offered quietly, keeping his voice neutral and non-confrontational. "Damn right you can," Ray snarled, taking another long drink from his beer. "And while you're at it, teach that sister of yours some respect. I heard her laughing earlier when I was trying to watch the game. Laughing. Like this house is some kind of playground instead of a place where people are trying to relax after dealing with the real world all day." Jude bit back the response that threatened to escape his lips. Ivy had been laughing because he had been making silly faces at her during the commercial breaks, trying to distract her from the tension that always filled the trailer when Ray was drinking heavily. It was one of the few ways Jude could still make his sister smile, and her laughter was one of the few bright spots in their increasingly dark world. But explaining that would only direct Ray's anger toward Ivy specifically, and that was something Jude would never allow. His job, the job he had assigned himself since Ray moved in with them, was to absorb as much of Ray's hostility as possible and keep his sister safe from the worst of their stepfather's unpredictable rages. "I'll talk to her," Jude said instead, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Ray took another long drink from his beer, studying Jude with bloodshot eyes that seemed to be having trouble focusing properly. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Boy, walking around here like you own the place, taking care of everything, acting like you're the man of the house. But you're just a kid. A worthless, useless kid who eats my food and uses my electricity and gives me nothing but grief in return." Outside, the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer and making the whole structure shudder on its foundation. The lights flickered briefly, threatening to go out entirely and leave them in darkness, with only the light from Ray's cigarette lighter to navigate by. Ray cursed and stumbled slightly, catching himself on the counter with his free hand. The bias. Power had been going on and off intermittently for the past hour, a common occurrence during severe weather in their remote location. Their trailer sat at the end of the power line, which meant they were among the first to lose electricity during storms and among the last to have it restored when utility crews began repair work. Jude had already located their emergency flashlight and made sure it had working batteries, another small preparation that their mother had taught him to make whenever bad weather was predicted. "Storm's getting worse," Jude observed, hoping to redirect Ray's attention away from complaints about the household and toward something external that could not be blamed on the children. "No kidding, genius," Ray sneered, his words becoming more slurred with each beer he consumed. "Good thing your mother's stuck at work all night. Maybe she'll finally see what it's like, being trapped with you two brats for hours on end with no escape and no relief." Jude felt a familiar anger building in his chest, a hot fury at the unfairness of Ray's complaints and the way he talked about them like they were burdens rather than children who deserved basic care and protection. But he pushed that anger down, burying it deep where it could not escape and make the situation worse. Getting angry with Ray never helped anything. It only made him more volatile, more dangerous, more likely to lash out at whatever target was closest and most defensible. Instead, Jude focused on the sound of the wind outside and tried to calculate how many inches of snow had fallen since dinner time. The weather forecast had called for 18 to 24 inches with whiteout conditions and temperatures dropping to dangerous levels. If the storm continued at its current intensity, they would be completely snowed in by morning, with no possibility of leaving the trailer until the roads were cleared. That thought should have been comforting. Being snowed in meant that Ray could not drive to Mickey's Tavern for more alcohol, and it meant that they would all be forced to stay inside where it was warm and relatively safe. But something about Ray's mood tonight felt different, more dangerous than his usual drunken complaints. There was an edge to his voice and a tension in his posture that suggested he was building towards something more serious than his typical verbal abuse. "You deaf?" Ray's voice cut through Jude's thoughts like a knife. "I said get this kitchen cleaned up, now, and I want it spotless, not just pushed around to look better." "Yes, sir," Jude replied, moving toward the sink with practiced efficiency. He had learned that "sir" seemed to calm Ray down sometimes, made him feel respected and in control of his domain. It was a small price to pay for keeping the peace, even temporarily, and it was one of many strategies Jude had developed for managing Ray's moods and protecting his sister from the worst of their stepfather's anger. Jude turned on the water and began washing the few dishes that remained in the sink, his movements efficient and quiet. He had learned to make himself as unobtrusive as possible during these interactions, completing whatever tasks Ray demanded without drawing additional attention or providing new reasons for complaint. Behind him, Ray opened another beer with the distinctive pop and hiss that had become the soundtrack of their evening hours. The television in the living room was turned up louder than necessary, some late-night movie with explosions and shouting that seemed to match Ray's internal state perfectly. Jude could hear Ivy's soft, steady breathing from the couch, a sound that told him she was probably pretending to sleep in hopes that Ray would forget she existed. Pretending to sleep was another survival tactic they had both perfected over the past 2 years. If Ray thought they were asleep, he was less likely to find reasons to interact with them. And if an interaction did become necessary, a child who appeared to have been sleeping was less likely to be accused of deliberately causing problems or seeking attention. As Jude dried the last bowl with a dish towel that had seen better days, he heard Ray's heavy footsteps moving toward the living room. His heart rate increased immediately, a conditioned response to the sound of Ray moving closer to wherever Ivy was located. When Ray was in the kitchen, drinking alone and complaining to himself, there was at least a physical buffer between him and Ivy. But when he moved to the living room, where Ivy was curled up on the couch with her stuffed rabbit, the danger level multiplied exponentially. "What's this?" Ray's voice carried from the living room, and Jude heard the distinctive sound of something being picked up and examined. Jude dried his hands quickly on his jeans and moved to the doorway between the kitchen and living room, positioning himself where he could see what was happening, but also where he could intervene if necessary. Ray was holding Ivy's stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, examining it with the kind of drunken focus that usually preceded either destruction or violence. Mr. Buttons had been Ivy's constant companion for as long as Jude could remember. Their mother had bought the rabbit at a yard sale when Ivy was 3 years old, back when they lived in a different town, and their biggest worry was stretching their grocery budget to last until the next paycheck. The rabbit was gray and white with one ear that stood up straight and one that flopped over, giving him a perpetually confused expression that Ivy found endlessly amusing. Over the years, Mr. Buttons had been washed and re-washed until his fur was thin and matted, sewn and re-sewn where active play had opened seams, and loved until he was more of a security blanket than a toy. Ivy took him everywhere, to doctor's appointments, to the rare visits with their grandmother, even to the bathroom when she was scared that Ray might be waiting in the hallway when she came out. "It's just her toy," Jude said carefully, trying to keep his voice casual and non-threatening. "Just her toy," Ray repeated mockingly, turning the rabbit over in his large hands like he was examining evidence of a crime. 6 years old and still playing with baby toys, like some kind of infant. When I was 6, I was working on my father's farm every morning before school, earning my keep and learning what it meant to contribute to a family. And here she is, cuddling stuffed animals and acting like the world owes her comfort and security. Ivy sat up on the couch, her blue eyes wide with the kind of fear that made Jude's chest tighten with protective rage. "Please," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost under the sound of the wind outside. "He's not hurting anything. He just helps me sleep." Ray's laugh was harsh and ugly, the sound of someone who had forgotten what genuine amusement felt like. "Not hurting anything? Everything about you hurts something, little girl. You hurt my wallet every time your mother has to buy you clothes or food or anything else. You hurt my peace of mind with your constant noise and mess and demands for attention. You hurt my relationship with your mother because she has to waste time and energy taking care of you instead of focusing on adult responsibilities." Ray paused to take another drink from his beer, swaying slightly as the alcohol continued to impair his balance and judgment. "Maybe it's time you learned what hurt really feels like. Maybe it's time you grew up a little bit and stopped depending on toys and other people to make you feel safe." "Ray, please," Jude stepped forward, moving between his stepfather and his sister with the kind of deliberate movement that he hoped would not provoke a more aggressive response. "She's just a kid. The rabbit doesn't hurt anyone, and it helps her get through the night. There's no harm in letting her keep it. Does it now?" Ray examined the stuffed animal more closely, turning it over in his hands like he was looking for hidden weapons or contraband. "Well, maybe she needs to learn to sleep without help. Maybe she needs to learn that the real world doesn't provide comfort and security just because you want it. Maybe she needs to understand that childhood ends a lot earlier than most people think it does." The next few seconds happened in slow motion, like a car accident that you can see coming but cannot prevent. Ray raised his arm, clearly intending to throw Mr. Buttons across the room, or possibly outside into the snow where the rabbit would be ruined beyond repair. Ivy, seeing her beloved companion about to be destroyed, lunged forward from the couch, with the kind of desperate courage that only comes from watching something precious being threatened. "No!" she cried, reaching for her toy with both hands extended. Ray, caught off guard by her sudden movement, and unsteady from the alcohol coursing. Through his system stumbled backward as Ivy's small body collided with his legs. His elbow connected with the beer can he had left on the side table, sending it flying through the air in a high arc. The contents splashed across the floor, the table, and Ray's shirt in a spray of cold liquid that made him curse loudly. The can itself struck the wall with a loud metallic clang before clattering to the floor and rolling under the television stand. For a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, the trailer was silent except for the howling wind outside and the sound of beer dripping from the table to the floor. Ray looked down at his soaked shirt, then at the puddle of beer spreading across the already stained carpet, then at Ivy, who had frozen in place halfway off the couch, her hand still reaching desperately for Mr. Buttons. When Ray's eyes met Ivy's, Jude saw something terrible there, something that went beyond his usual anger and frustration and drunken irritation. It was rage, pure and simple, focused entirely on his 6-year-old sister like a spotlight that would burn whatever it touched. "Now look what you've done," Ray said quietly, and somehow that quiet voice was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "It was an accident," Jude said quickly, stepping closer to Ivy and positioning himself where he could grab her and pull her away if Ray made any sudden movements. "She didn't mean to knock over your beer. She was just trying to get her rabbit back. I can clean it up right now, and I can get you another beer from the refrigerator." "Shut up," Ray snapped, never taking his eyes off Ivy. "This little brat has been nothing but trouble since the day I moved in here. Crying at night when I'm trying to sleep, whining about being hungry when there's perfectly good food in the house, making messes that someone else has to clean up, costing money we don't have for clothes and doctor visits and all the other expenses that come with kids." "It's just beer," Jude protested, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice. "It's not a big deal. I can clean it up in 2 minutes, and I can buy you another 6-pack with my allowance money from helping Mr. Peterson shovel his driveway." But Ray was not listening anymore. He had entered that dangerous zone where logic and reason no longer applied, where alcohol and anger combined to create something monstrous that saw children as acceptable targets for frustration that belonged elsewhere. Jude recognized the signs from previous encounters: the clenched jaw, the white knuckles, the way Ray's breathing had become shallow and rapid like an animal preparing to attack. "Ray, please," Jude tried again, moving fully in front of Ivy now and spreading his arms wide to make himself a bigger target. "Please, she's sorry. We're both sorry. Just let me clean up the mess and get you a fresh beer and we'll stay out of your way for the rest of the night. You won't even know we're here." Ray's hand shot out faster than Jude could react, shoving him roughly to the side with enough force to send him stumbling across the small space. Jude's shoulder hit the corner of the coffee table hard enough to send sharp pain shooting down his arm and into his fingers. From his position on the floor, he watched in horror as Ray advanced on Ivy with the deliberate movements of someone who had made a decision and would not be deterred from carrying it out. "Time for a lesson in respect," Ray growled, dropping Mr. Buttons on the floor and grabbing Ivy by the arm to haul her to her feet. "No!" Jude scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder and the dizziness that came from hitting his head on the table. "Leave her alone. Whatever you were going to do to her, do it to me instead. I'm the one who should have been watching her better. I'm the one who should have kept her quiet. Punish me, not her." For a moment, Ray paused, considering the offer, with the calculating expression of someone weighing his options. Then he shook his head slowly, a motion that seemed to take great effort given his level of intoxication. "Nah," he said finally. "She made the mess. She pays the price. That's how the real world works, boy. Actions have consequences, and those consequences don't get transferred to other people just because you want to play hero." What happened next would replay in Jude's mind for the rest of his life, frame by frame, like a movie he could not turn off or escape. Ray's free hand rose up in a motion that Jude recognized from previous discipline sessions, and Jude threw himself forward with every ounce of strength and desperation he possessed. His small hands grabbed at Ray's arm, his body weight nothing compared to the man's bulk, but desperation giving him a strength he did not know he possessed. "Get off me!" Ray roared, shaking his arm violently to dislodge the child who was clinging to him like a determined spider. The force of being shaken loose sent Jude flying backward through the air. He crashed into the wall next to the kitchen doorway and slumped to the floor, dazed and struggling to understand what had happened. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Ivy scream, a sound of pure terror that cut through his confusion and brought the world back into sharp focus. Then he heard something else, something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. It was not the slap he had expected to hear, the sound of Ray's hand connecting with Ivy's face or arm or shoulder. Instead, there was a loud thud, followed by Ray's surprised curse, followed by the kind of silence that makes your heart stop beating. Jude shook his head violently, trying to clear his vision and understand what had happened. When his eyes finally focused, he saw Ray standing over Ivy's motionless form near the kitchen table. She had fallen awkwardly, her small body crumpled against the base of the table, her head at an unnatural angle that made Jude's stomach clench with terror. Blood was already beginning to mat in her blonde hair where it had struck the sharp corner of the table, the same corner that Ray had been complaining about for months because it stuck out too far into the narrow walkway between the kitchen and living room. "Ivy!" Jude crawled across the floor to his sister, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he could hear it in his ears. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The cut on her head was bleeding freely, creating a small puddle on the already stained carpet beneath her. When Jude gently touched her shoulder and whispered her name, she did not respond at all. Her skin felt cold, too cold, and her lips had a bluish tinge that terrified him more than the blood or the stillness. "Look what you made me do," Ray said, his voice slurred and uncertain now. "This is your fault, boy. If you hadn't interfered, if you had just minded your own business, if she had just taken her punishment like she was supposed to, none of this would have happened." Jude looked up at his stepfather with an expression of pure hatred that surprised them both. For the first time in his 9 years of life, he felt something close to murderous rage, a fury so complete and overwhelming that it made his vision blur around the edges. "You need to call an ambulance," he said, his voice steady despite the terror and anger coursing through his veins. "Right now. She's really hurt." Ray laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor or humanity. "Ambulance. Do you have any idea what an ambulance costs? Do you know what happens when ambulances show up at places like this asking questions about how kids get hurt? Your mother would lose her job, we'd lose this place, and you kids would end up in foster care faster than you could blink." "She's hurt," Jude insisted, his voice growing stronger, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. "Really hurt. Look at her, Ray. Look at all that blood. This isn't like the other times. This is different." Ray did look, and for a moment, something like regret flickered across his features. But it was quickly replaced by the calculating expression Jude had learned to dread, the look that meant Ray was more concerned about protecting himself than helping anyone else. "She'll be fine," Ray declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "Kids are tough. They bounce back from everything. She just got knocked around a little bit, same as kids have been getting knocked around since the beginning of time. She'll wake up in the morning with a headache and a lesson learned about respecting her elders." But Jude had seen injuries before, had learned to recognize the difference between Ray's usual violence and something genuinely dangerous. He had been present for every accident Ivy had suffered, every fall that required explanation, every bump that left marks lasting for weeks. This was not like those other times. The way Ivy's head had hit the table, the sickening sound it had made, the amount of blood now pooling beneath her, the fact that she was not responding at all to his voice or touch. This was something she might not wake up from at all. "Ray, please," Jude begged, his voice breaking on the words. "Please call someone. Call Mama at the diner. Call Dr. Hayes at the hospital. Call 911. Call somebody who can help her." But Ray was already walking away, heading back toward the kitchen and his interrupted supply of beer. His movements were unsteady, and he had to use the wall for support as he navigated the short distance from the living room to the refrigerator. "She's fine," he repeated, but Jude could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice now. "Just leave her alone and let her sleep it off. Kids sleep off everything, fevers, bumps, bruises, everything. By morning she'll be running around, making noise again, and you'll see that you were worried about nothing. Clean up that mess while you're at it," Ray added, gesturing vaguely toward the puddle of spilled beer. "Your mother shouldn't have to come home to a disaster area just because you two can't behave yourselves when adults are trying to relax." Jude heard the refrigerator open, heard the distinctive sound of another beer being opened. Within minutes, Ray's heavy footsteps were moving toward the back bedroom, where he would probably pass out until well past noon the next day. Soon the trailer was filled with the sound of Ray's drunken snoring, a rumbling noise that competed with the howling wind outside and left Jude alone with his unconscious sister and the weight of an impossible decision. Carefully, gently, Jude gathered Ivy into his arms. She was completely limp and unresponsive, her breathing worryingly shallow and irregular. The cut on her head had stopped bleeding as heavily, but the surrounding area was already beginning to swell, creating a lump that felt hot and tight under Jude's tentative fingers. When he whispered her name directly into her ear, she did not react at all. When he gently shook her shoulder, her head lolled to one side in a way that made his stomach lurch with terror. The phone line had been out since the storm started, a frequent occurrence in their isolated location when high winds brought down power lines or damaged telephone poles. Their nearest neighbor, Mr. Peterson, lived a quarter-mile away through snow that was now almost 3 feet deep and still falling. Even if Jude could make it to Peterson's house, the old man did not drive anymore, and his own phone service was probably just as unreliable as theirs. Ray was unconscious and would remain that way until morning, lost in the kind of alcohol-induced stupor that nothing short of a house fire could penetrate. Their mother was trapped at Millie's diner by the same storm that had cut off all their other options, working a double shift that would keep her away until at least 10 o'clock the next morning. Jude looked out the window at the swirling white, chaos beyond, and felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He could wait and hope that Ivy would wake up on her own, that her injuries were not as serious as they appeared, that morning would bring help and explanations and solutions he could not see right now. Or he could do something that terrified him more than anything else in his young life. He could brave the storm and carry his sister 4 miles through blizzard conditions to the only place in Millbrook where someone would help them without asking questions they could not answer safely. The wind outside was howling like a living thing, rattling the trailer's thin walls and threatening to tear the whole structure from its foundation. The snow was falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to mere feet, and the temperature had dropped to levels that could kill an adult in a matter of hours, let alone 2 children without proper winter gear. But as Jude sat holding his unconscious sister, feeling how cold her skin had become and listening to her increasingly labored breathing, he realized that staying was not really an option. Ivy was hurt badly, possibly dying, and waiting for help that might never come was just another way of giving up on her completely. He thought about the route he had described to Ivy so many times, transforming it from a desperate escape plan into an adventure story. Down Maple Ridge Road to the fence posts that lined up like soldiers. Across Miller's Creek on the old wooden bridge with the loose board that creaked like a mouse. Through the heart of town on Main Street, past all the familiar landmarks, straight to the big brick hospital with the blue emergency sign and the lights that stayed on all night. 4 miles. In perfect weather, with an adult driving. It was a 10-minute trip. Walking in good conditions, it might take an hour and a half. But in a blizzard, carrying an unconscious child, with visibility near zero, and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, it would be the most dangerous thing Jude had ever attempted. But it was also the only chance Ivy had. Jude Mitchell was 9 years old, and he was about to make a choice that would change everything. He was going to wrap his sister in every blanket he could find, put her on the plastic sled that sat unused on their back porch, and drag her 4 miles through the worst storm Vermont had seen in a decade. Because that was what big brothers did. They protected their sisters, no matter what it cost them. They found a way to save the people they loved, even when there was no way to be found. Even when they were just 9 years old and scared and alone in a world that seemed determined to hurt the most innocent people in it. Jude looked down at Ivy's pale face, brushed a strand of bloody hair away from her forehead, and began to plan their journey into the storm. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 11:15 when Jude finally stopped trying to wake his sister. For the past hour he had whispered her name, gently shaken her shoulders, even tried tickling her feet, the way their mother sometimes did on lazy weekend mornings. Nothing worked. Ivy remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin growing colder despite the blankets Jude had wrapped around her small body. The lump on the side of her head had continued to swell, creating a distortion that made her look like someone else entirely. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but dried blood had matted her blonde hair into dark, sticky clumps that reminded Jude of the rust stains on their trailer's exterior walls. When he pressed his ear to her chest, her heartbeat sounded fast and fluttery, like a bird trapped in a cage. From the back bedroom came the steady rumble of Ray's snoring, punctuated occasionally by mumbled words that Jude could not understand and did not want to. The man would sleep for hours yet, lost in the kind of alcohol-induced stupor that made him unreachable and unaware of anything happening around him. Even if the trailer caught fire, it would take several minutes of direct physical contact to rouse him enough to understand the danger. Outside, the storm had intensified beyond anything Jude had seen in his 9 years of Vermont winters. The wind was howling like a pack of wolves, driving snow horizontally across their small yard and creating drifts that reached nearly to the bottoms of their windows. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero according to the thermometer. Their mother kept mounted outside the kitchen window, and the wind chill was making it feel even colder. The power had gone out completely about 20 minutes ago, plunging the trailer into darkness broken only by the emergency flashlight Jude had retrieved from their kitchen drawer. The beam created a small circle of yellow light that made everything beyond it seem even darker and more threatening. Without the electric heater running, the temperature inside the trailer was dropping steadily, and Jude could already see his breath forming small clouds when he exhaled. He had tried the phone one more time, even though he knew the lines were down. The receiver produced no dial tone, no static, no sound at all except the echo of his own breathing. Their cell phone, an ancient device their mother used only for emergencies, showed no signal bars and a battery that was almost dead because Ray had forgotten to pay the electric bill on time, and they had been running everything on minimal power for the past week. Mr. Peterson, their closest neighbor, lived a quarter-mile down Maple Ridge Road, in a house that was probably just as dark and isolated as their trailer tonight. Even if Jude could somehow make it through the snow to Peterson's front door, the old man was 83 years old with a bad heart and no transportation beyond an ancient pickup truck that had not started reliably in years. Peterson's phone service came from the same lines that served their trailer, which meant he was just as cut off from the outside world as they were. The nearest house after Peterson's belonged to the Hendricks family, but that was another half-mile farther down the mountain, and the Hendricks had a reputation for not getting involved in other people's business. Even if they had working phones and reliable transportation, convincing them to help 2 children in the middle of a blizzard would require explanations that Jude could not provide without making everything worse for his mother. Jude sat cross-legged on the floor next to the couch where Ivy lay motionless, holding the flashlight in one hand and stroking her hair with the other. The silence in the trailer was broken only by the storm outside, Ray's snoring from the bedroom, and the occasional creak of the building's frame as it flexed under the pressure of the wind. It was the kind of deep, heavy silence that made every small sound seem amplified and threatening. He had been thinking about the route to the hospital for the past hour, mentally retracing every step of the journey he had described to Ivy so many times as a bedtime story. 4 miles from their trailer to Millbrook General Hospital. 4 miles that in normal conditions would be challenging but manageable for a 9-year-old boy. 4 miles that in current conditions might as well be 400. But as he sat there watching his sister's labored breathing and feeling how cold her skin had become, Jude realized that the difficulty of the journey was irrelevant. Ivy was hurt badly, possibly dying, and staying in the trailer was just a slow way of giving up on her completely. If she died while he sat there waiting for help that was not coming, he would never forgive himself. At least if he tried to get her to the hospital and failed, he would know that he had done everything possible to save her. The plastic sled on their back porch was where it had been sitting unused since last winter, when their mother had bought it at an after-Christmas sale with hopes of giving them some normal childhood fun. Ray had complained about the expense and pointed out that they lived too far from any good sledding hills to make it worthwhile, but their mother had insisted that every child deserved at least one toy that was purely for enjoyment. They had used it exactly twice, once for a brief trip down the gentle slope behind their trailer, and once when Jude had pulled Ivy around their small yard while she giggled and threw snowballs at imaginary targets. After that, Ray's increasingly frequent complaints about useless junk cluttering up the place had made it clear that the sled was more trouble than it was worth as a source of entertainment. But tonight, that bright red plastic sled might be the tool that saved Ivy's life. Jude left his sister's side long enough to retrieve the sled from the porch, moving carefully in the darkness and trying not to make any noise that might disturb Ray's alcohol-induced sleep. The back door was frozen shut, and it took several minutes of careful work with his shoulder and elbow to break the ice seal that had formed around the frame. When the door finally opened, a blast of Arctic air hit him with such force that it literally took his breath away. The sled was buried under 6 inches of snow that had blown onto the porch, despite the partial shelter provided by their trailer's overhang. Jude brushed it clean and dragged it inside, noting that the rope handle was still attached and seemed strong enough to support Ivy's weight. The sled itself was about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, large enough to hold his sister comfortably, with room for extra blankets and supplies. Back in the living room, Jude began gathering everything he thought they might need for the journey. Every blanket in the trailer went onto his pile, the comforter from their mother's bed, the Afghan their grandmother had crocheted years ago, the sleeping bag Jude used when the heater could not keep his room warm enough for comfort. He found their warmest winter coats, thick socks, mittens, and the knit hats their mother had insisted on buying even though Ray complained about the cost. The emergency flashlight would have to come with them, even though the batteries were not new, and he had no idea how long they would last. He found a second flashlight in their kitchen junk drawer, but when he tested it, the bulb flickered weakly and went out after a few seconds. There were no spare batteries anywhere in the trailer. Another victim of Ray's insistence that they were living beyond their means and needed to cut expenses wherever possible. Food was not a priority for a journey that would either succeed within a few hours or fail catastrophically, but Jude packed 2 granola bars from their nearly empty pantry and a plastic bottle of water that he hoped would not freeze solid before they reached their destination. He also took the small first aid kit their mother kept under the bathroom sink, even though he had no idea what to do with most of the supplies it contained. The most important item was a plastic garbage bag that he could use to keep Ivy's blankets dry if the snow became too heavy. Wet blankets in sub-zero temperatures would be worse than no blankets at all, and keeping his sister warm and dry was going to be the key to keeping her alive during the journey. Preparing Ivy for transport was the most difficult part of the process, both physically and emotionally. She remained completely unconscious as Jude carefully maneuvered her into her warmest winter coat, a purple parka that their mother had bought at a thrift store, and that was slightly too big for Ivy's. Small frame, the extra room made it easier to get the coat on her limp arms, but it also made her look even more vulnerable and childlike than usual. Her winter boots were still damp from when she had played in the snow earlier that afternoon, but they were the warmest footwear she owned. Jude managed to get them on her feet, along with 2 pairs of thick socks. Though her feet were so cold, they felt like blocks of ice through the fabric. He pulled her knit hat down over her injured head as gently as possible, noting that the lump from her injury was still growing and was now visible even under the thick wool. The process of wrapping Ivy in blankets and securing her on the sled was like preparing a fragile package for shipment to an unknown destination. Jude used the sleeping bag as a base layer, then wrapped her in the comforter, then added the Afghan on top for extra warmth. He secured everything with the rope that normally held their garbage can lid in place, creating a cocoon that covered everything except her face. When he was finished, Ivy looked impossibly small and fragile on the bright red sled, like a doll that someone had carefully packaged for storage. Her face was the only part of her still visible, pale and still in the flashlight's beam, her lips slightly blue despite all the layers of insulation surrounding her. "I'm going to get you help," Jude whispered to his unconscious sister, though he had no idea if she could hear him. "I'm going to take you to Dr. Hayes, and she's going to fix whatever's wrong. And tomorrow morning you'll be awake and complaining about the hospital food and asking when we can go home." He had been putting off the moment when he would have, to get himself ready for the journey, partly because each step made the plan feel more real and more terrifying, and partly because he was still hoping for some miraculous alternative to present itself. But as the clock moved past midnight and Ivy's breathing became even more labored, he knew that waiting was no longer an option. Jude's winter coat was a hand-me-down from a family at their mother's church, designed for a child several years older and several sizes larger. The sleeves hung past his hands and the hem reached almost to his knees, making him look like he was wearing an adult's clothes. But the extra size meant extra warmth, and warmth was going to be more important than mobility during the next few hours. His boots were his own, purchased new at the beginning of the school year with money their mother had saved for weeks. They were waterproof and insulated, designed for Vermont winters, but they had never been tested in conditions like the ones waiting outside their door. He put on 2 pairs of socks, then his boots, then tested the laces to make sure they were tight enough to prevent snow from getting inside. Gloves were going to be crucial for gripping the sled's rope, but the only pairs he could find were thin cotton work gloves that their mother used for gardening. They would be better than nothing, but they would not provide much protection against frostbite during a 4-mile journey in sub-zero temperatures. He put them on anyway, knowing that losing fingers to frostbite was a small price to pay for getting Ivy to safety. The final item was a scarf that he wrapped around his face, covering his nose and mouth, and leaving only his eyes exposed. The knit fabric would help prevent his lungs from being damaged by breathing supercooled air, and it would provide some protection against snow being driven into his face by the wind. When he was fully dressed for the journey, Jude looked like a small, determined polar explorer preparing for an expedition into unknown territory. He could barely move in all the layers of clothing, and his vision was partially obscured by the scarf around his face, but he was as prepared as possible given their limited resources. The last thing he did before leaving was write a note for his mother, even though he had no idea when she would be able to return from work or whether she would find it before finding them. He used a pencil and a paper bag from their kitchen, writing in block letters that would be easy to read even in dim light. "Mama, Ivy got hurt bad. Ray hit her and she won't wake up. Taking her to hospital. Don't worry. Love, Jude." He left the note on the kitchen table where it would be impossible to miss, weighted down with a coffee mug to prevent it from being blown away if the wind somehow got inside the trailer. Then he turned his attention to the task of getting himself and Ivy out the front door and into the storm. The door was frozen shut, just like the back door had been, requiring several minutes of careful work to break the ice seal. When it finally opened, the force of the wind was so strong that it nearly knocked Jude backward into the trailer. Snow immediately began blowing inside, creating a small drift on their doormat within seconds. The sled runners moved smoothly across the trailer's linoleum floor, but Jude knew that would change as soon as they encountered the deep snow outside. He would have to pull harder, rest more frequently, and navigate around obstacles that were invisible in the darkness, and swirling snow. Standing in the doorway, looking out at the white chaos that awaited them, Jude felt fear unlike anything he had ever experienced. This was not the manageable anxiety of dealing with Ray's anger or the worry about having enough money for groceries. This was primal terror at the thought of venturing into conditions that could kill them both within hours. But behind him, Ivy lay unconscious and growing colder by the minute. Ahead of him, 4 miles through the storm, Dr. Hayes and the hospital staff waited with the knowledge and equipment needed to save his sister's life. The choice was not really a choice at all. Jude Mitchell took a deep breath, gripped the sled rope with both hands, and stepped out into the storm that would either deliver them to safety or claim them both before morning. The wind immediately tried to push him backward. The snow stung, his exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles, and the cold was so intense it made his lungs ache with every breath. But he did not look back. 4 miles to salvation. 4 miles to save the only person in the world who depended on him completely. 4 miles that a 9-year-old boy was determined to travel, no matter what it cost him. The journey to save Ivy Mitchell had begun. The first 100 yards nearly broke Jude's resolve completely. The moment he stepped off their front porch, dragging the sled behind him, the full fury of the Vermont blizzard hit them with a force that seemed almost personal in its violence. The wind was not just blowing, it was attacking, driving snow, horizontally with such intensity that it felt like being sandblasted with ice crystals. Within seconds, the scarf around Jude's face was caked with snow, and breathing became a conscious effort that required him to turn his head away from the wind between each inhalation. The snow was deeper than he had anticipated, reaching nearly to his waist in some places where it had drifted against the side of their trailer. The sled, which had moved so smoothly across the linoleum floor inside, now fought him with every step. The runners that were designed to glide effortlessly over packed snow struggled against the loose, powder-fine accumulation that offered no firm surface for traction. Jude's first steps away from the trailer taught him that his mental picture of this journey had been hopelessly optimistic. He had imagined following the road, using the fence posts as markers, maintaining a steady pace that would get them to the hospital within 2 or 3 hours. The reality was that he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. The road was completely invisible under the snow, and what he had thought would be a challenging walk was proving to be a life or death struggle against the elements. The fence posts that lined Maple Ridge Road, the ones he had described to Ivy as soldiers marching in formation, were now just occasional dark shapes appearing and disappearing in the swirling snow like ghosts. Some were completely buried, leaving only their tops visible above the drifts. Others had been knocked askew by the wind, pointing in random directions that provided no guidance for navigation. Jude quickly realized that following the fence line was not going to be as simple as he had hoped. After 10 minutes of exhausting effort, he had traveled perhaps 50 yards from their trailer door. His legs were already aching from the effort of pushing through snow that sometimes reached above his knees, and his hands were starting to lose feeling despite the cotton gloves he wore. The rope handle of the sled was cutting into his palms, and he could feel blisters beginning to form where the rough cordage rubbed against his skin. But the most terrifying realization was how quickly he was losing his sense of direction. The storm created a white void that made every direction look identical. When he turned back to check on their trailer, it had already vanished into the swirling darkness, leaving him with no reference point except the fence posts that appeared and disappeared like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Ivy had not made a sound since they left the trailer. Jude stopped every few minutes to check on her, brushing snow away from her face and making sure the blankets were still securely wrapped around her small body. She remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid, her skin unnaturally pale, in the beam of his flashlight. The lump on her head seemed to be growing larger, creating a distortion that made her look like a stranger wearing his sister's face. The temperature was dropping steadily as they moved further from the shelter of their trailer. Jude's breath formed clouds that froze almost instantly, creating a layer of ice on the scarf around his mouth. His feet were already getting cold, despite the thick socks and waterproof boots, and he could feel the beginnings of that dangerous numbness that preceded frostbite. But stopping was not an option. Every minute they spent in the storm was a minute that Ivy's condition could worsen. A minute that brought them closer to the point where even reaching the hospital would not be enough to save her. Jude forced himself to keep moving, pulling the sled through snow that seemed determined to trap them both. The first mile took him nearly an hour to complete, a pace that made the entire journey seem impossible. At this rate, they would not reach the hospital until well past sunrise, assuming they survived that long in the brutal conditions. Jude's fingers were becoming clumsy from the cold, making it difficult to maintain his grip on the sled rope. His legs felt like concrete pillars, heavy and unresponsive, requiring conscious effort to lift and move forward through the deepening snow. Worse than the physical exhaustion was the growing fear that he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe Ray had been right. Maybe Ivy would have been fine if they had just waited for morning. Maybe dragging her out into a killer storm was going to accomplish nothing except getting them both frozen to death in a snowdrift where no one would find them. Until spring. But then he would check on Ivy again, see how still and pale she had become, hear the disturbing rattle in her breathing, and he would know that waiting had never really been an option. Whatever happened out here in the storm, at least he was doing something. At least he was fighting for her instead of just sitting helplessly while she slipped away. The second mile brought new challenges that tested Jude's determination in ways he had not anticipated. The wind had picked up even more, creating whiteout conditions that made navigation almost impossible. Several times he lost the fence line entirely, wandering in circles until panic gave him the strength to search more systematically for the next post. The terrain was more difficult than he remembered from their previous trips to town. What had seemed like gentle slopes when riding in their mother's car became exhausting climbs when attempted on foot while dragging a sled through deep snow. There were hidden obstacles, fallen branches, rocks, holes that had been invisible, under the accumulation, that threatened to overturn the sled or send Jude tumbling into a drift that might be impossible to escape. His hands had progressed beyond cold into genuine pain. The thin cotton gloves were completely inadequate for the conditions, and he could feel the rope handle cutting into his palms with every step. When he tried to adjust his grip, he realized that his fingers were becoming stiff and unresponsive, the early stages of frostbite setting in despite his efforts to keep moving. But the most frightening moment came when he lost the fence line completely during a particularly intense burst of wind and snow. For 10 terrifying minutes, Jude wandered in what he thought was the right direction, pulling the sled through snow that seemed to grow deeper with every step. When he finally found another fence post, he had no idea if it was part of the same line he had been following, or if he had somehow wandered onto someone else's property. The confusion and panic of those lost minutes made him realize how easy it would be to become completely disoriented in the storm. If he lost the road entirely, they could wander for hours in the wrong direction, using up their strength and his flashlight batteries while moving further away from help instead of closer to it. To make matters worse, his flashlight was beginning to dim. The yellow beam that had seemed so bright and reassuring in their trailer was now noticeably weaker, casting a smaller circle of visibility that made navigation even more difficult. Jude estimated that the batteries had maybe 2 hours of life remaining, which meant that the last half of their journey would likely be completed in total darkness. The third mile was when everything started to go wrong at once. It began with Ivy. During one of his regular checks, Jude noticed that her breathing had become even more labored, with longer pauses between each breath that made his heart race with terror. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that was visible even in the dim flashlight beam, and when he touched her face, it felt cold as marble despite all the blankets surrounding her. For a moment, Jude thought she might have died while he was dragging her through the storm. The possibility hit him like a physical blow, making him drop to his knees beside the sled and press his ear to her chest to listen for a heartbeat. It was there, but faint and irregular, like an engine that was running out of fuel. "Come on, Ivy," he whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Don't give up on me now. We're more than halfway there. Dr. Hayes is waiting for us, and she's going to fix everything that's wrong. You just have to hold on a little bit longer." But Ivy did not respond to his voice or his touch. If anything, she seemed to be slipping further away with each passing minute, her small body becoming more still and lifeless despite his desperate efforts to keep her warm and safe. The second crisis came when they reached Miller's Creek. The old wooden bridge that Jude had described to Ivy as part of their adventure story was barely recognizable under the snow and ice that had accumulated on its surface. What had seemed like a minor landmark during their previous trips to town now looked like a death trap that could send them both plunging into the frozen creek below. The bridge was narrow, maybe 6 feet wide, with no railings to prevent someone from walking off the edge into the water. Under normal conditions, it was a simple matter to cross the 20-foot span and continue down the road. But tonight, with snow covering the planks and ice making every surface treacherous, the bridge represented a challenge that could end their journey before they reached town. Jude stood at the edge of the bridge for several minutes, trying to figure out how to get the sled across safely. The runners that had been struggling in the deep snow would be completely useless on the ice-covered planks. If he tried to pull the sled across and lost his footing, they could both end up in Miller's Creek, where the flowing water would soak through their clothes and kill them within minutes. But there was no alternative route. The creek was too wide and deep to ford, especially in winter conditions, and this was the only bridge for miles in either direction. If they could not cross here, their journey would end in failure with Ivy still 2 miles away from the help she desperately needed. Jude made the decision to abandon the sled. It was an agonizing choice, giving up the tool that had made it possible to transport Ivy this far. But the bridge was simply too dangerous to cross while dragging anything behind him. Instead, he would have to carry his sister across the span, then figure out how to continue the journey on the other side. Unwrapping Ivy from the blankets and lifting her into his arms was like handling a life-sized doll. She was completely limp, offering no assistance as he struggled to position her weight in a way that would allow him to maintain his balance on the treacherous bridge. The sleeping bag and most of the blankets had to be left behind with the sled, leaving Ivy with only her winter coat and the Afghan their grandmother had made. Carrying his unconscious sister, Jude began the most terrifying 20 feet of his young life. The bridge planks were slick with ice, making every step a potential disaster. The wind was stronger over the open water, threatening to knock them, both off the narrow span and into the creek below. Jude had to move slowly, testing each footstep before committing his full weight, while trying to shield Ivy from the worst of the wind and snow. Halfway across, his foot slipped on a particularly icy plank. For a heart-stopping moment, Jude felt himself beginning to fall, Ivy's weight throwing off his balance and sending them both toward the edge of the bridge. He managed to recover by dropping to one knee and catching himself with his free hand. But the near miss left him shaking with adrenaline and terror. By the time they reached the other side of the bridge, Jude was exhausted, and his sister was noticeably colder. Without the insulation provided by the sleeping bag and extra blankets, Ivy's body temperature was dropping even faster than before. Jude could see his breath and hers forming clouds in the frigid air, but hers were becoming smaller and less frequent with each passing minute. The abandoned sled sat on the far side of the bridge like an accusation, loaded with supplies they could no longer carry but desperately needed. Jude stood there for several minutes, holding his unconscious sister and trying to figure out how to continue the journey without the tool that had made it possible to get this far. The solution came to him slowly, born of desperation and the kind of creative thinking that emerges when all conventional options have been exhausted. He could not carry Ivy for 2 more miles, but he could carry her for shorter distances, resting frequently and using whatever shelter he could find along the way. Main Street was lined with buildings that would provide some protection from the wind. There were doorways where he could stop to rest, overhangs that would give them brief respites from the snow, and streetlights that would help with navigation even if his flashlight died completely. It would be slower than using the sled, but it would get them to the hospital eventually. What followed was the most grueling period of Jude's young life. He carried Ivy for as long as his strength lasted, usually no more than a few hundred yards at a time, then found whatever shelter he could for a brief rest before continuing. His arms ached from her weight, his legs trembled with exhaustion, and his hands had progressed beyond pain into complete numbness. The buildings of downtown Millbrook appeared out of the storm like islands of solidity in a sea of white chaos. Miller's Hardware, with its red sign barely visible through the snow. The post office with its flag whipping frantically in the wind. The Congregational Church with its tall white steeple, a landmark that told Jude they were finally getting close to their destination. But with each stop, Ivy seemed to slip further away. Her breathing had become so shallow that Jude had to press his ear to her chest to confirm she was still alive. Her skin had taken on a waxy appearance that terrified him, and her lips had turned from blue to an alarming shade of gray that suggested her body was beginning to shut down. "We're almost there," Jude whispered to her during one of their rest stops in the doorway of the church. "One more mile, maybe less. Dr. Hayes is going to take care of you, and everything is going to be okay. You just have to hang on a little bit longer." But even as he spoke the words, Jude wondered if he was lying to them both. Ivy looked like she was dying, and he was not sure that even reaching the hospital would be enough to save her at this point. The storm had taken a terrible toll on both of them, and time was running out faster than he had anticipated. The final mile through downtown Millbrook was a nightmare of exhaustion, cold, and growing desperation. Jude's flashlight finally died. Completely, leaving them dependent on the occasional streetlight for navigation. The wind had picked up again, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Several times, Jude became disoriented and had to backtrack when he realized he had been walking in the wrong direction. The familiar landmarks of downtown were distorted by snow and darkness, making everything look strange and threatening. What should have been a straightforward walk down Main Street became a maze of confusion and false starts. His body was beginning to betray him in frightening ways. His hands had no feeling at all, making it difficult to maintain his grip on Ivy's limp form. His feet were so cold that he could no longer feel them inside his boots, and he had to look down periodically to make sure he was still walking in a straight line. The early stages of hypothermia were setting in, making his thinking slow and confused. But somehow, through sheer determination and the kind of stubborn love that refuses to accept defeat, Jude kept moving. One step at a time, one building at a time, one streetlight at a time, he carried his dying sister through the storm toward the only place in Millbrook where miracles were possible. When the blue emergency sign of Millbrook General Hospital finally appeared through the swirling snow, Jude thought he might be hallucinating. The building looked impossibly far away, like something from a dream that keeps receding no matter how fast you run toward it. But as he stumbled closer, using the last reserves of his strength to carry Ivy across the hospital's parking lot, he realized that they had actually made it. 4 miles through the worst storm Vermont had seen in a decade. 4 miles that had taken nearly 6 hours to complete. 4 miles that had pushed a 9-year-old boy beyond every limit he thought he possessed. Jude Mitchell collapsed through the emergency room doors at 6:30 in the morning, his unconscious sister in his arms, both of them more dead than alive, but somehow miraculously still breathing. They had made it. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectations, against the fury of nature itself, they had made it to safety. Now it was up to others to save them both. The emergency room doors of Millbrook General Hospital slid open with a mechanical whisper, releasing a blast of warm air that hit Jude like a physical force. After 6 hours in sub-zero temperatures, the sudden warmth was almost painful, making his frozen skin burn as circulation began to return to his extremities. He stumbled forward 3 more steps, his legs finally giving out completely, and collapsed onto the polished linoleum floor with Ivy still clutched in his arms. "Help," he whispered, though his voice was so hoarse from breathing frozen air that the word came out as barely more than a croak. "Please help her." The emergency room at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning was usually quiet, staffed by a skeleton crew handling the occasional overnight crisis. But the sight of two children appearing out of a killer blizzard, both showing clear signs of severe hypothermia and exposure, galvanized the medical team into immediate action. Dr. Vivian Hayes was the first to reach them, dropping to her knees beside Jude and Ivy with the kind of practiced urgency that comes from 15 years of emergency medicine. She was a woman in her early 40s with prematurely gray hair and gentle hands that never seemed to stop moving, constantly checking, examining, assessing the condition of whoever needed her help. "My God," she breathed, taking in the sight of two children who looked more like disaster survivors than residents of a small Vermont town. "Nurse Thompson, I need 2 gurneys here immediately, and get Dr. Martinez up from pediatrics. We've got severe hypothermia and possible head trauma." Jude tried to explain what had happened, tried to tell Dr. Hayes about Ray and the trailer and the storm, but his words came out in a jumbled rush that made no sense even to him. The warmth of the hospital was making him dizzy, and the adrenaline that had sustained him through the journey was finally wearing off, leaving him shaking and confused. "Easy, son," Dr. Hayes said, her voice calm and reassuring despite the obvious urgency of the situation. "You're safe now. Both of you are safe. We're going to take care of your sister, but I need you to stay calm and help me understand what happened." 2 nurses appeared with gurneys, moving with the efficient speed of medical professionals who knew that minutes could mean the difference between life and death. They lifted Ivy's unconscious form onto one stretcher while helping Jude onto another, despite his protests that he was fine, and only Ivy needed help. "You've got severe hypothermia," Dr. Hayes explained, as they wheeled both children toward the treatment rooms. "Your core body temperature is dangerously low, and we need to warm you up gradually to prevent shock. Ivy's condition is more serious, but you're not out of danger either." As they moved through the hospital corridors, Jude caught glimpses of the controlled chaos that surrounded emergency medical care. Nurses appeared with armloads of heated blankets, while technicians wheeled in machines whose purposes he could not identify. Someone was calling for blood work and x-rays, while someone else was checking supplies and preparing equipment. They separated the children in the treatment area, taking Ivy into one room while settling Jude in another. Through the thin walls, he could hear the urgent voices of the medical team working on his sister, calling out vital signs, discussing treatment options, coordinating care with the kind of professional efficiency that both reassured and terrified him. Dr. Hayes stayed with Jude, wrapping him in heated blankets while examining his hands and feet for signs of frostbite. Her touch was gentle but thorough, checking his fingers and toes for the telltale signs of tissue damage that could result in permanent injury or amputation. "You've got some frostbite on your fingertips," she said, "but it's not severe. We caught it in time. Your feet are better. The boots protected them. You're a very lucky young man." "Is Ivy going to be okay?" Jude asked, his voice still weak, but becoming clearer as the warmth began to restore normal function to his throat and lungs. Dr. Hayes paused in her examination, her expression becoming more serious. "She's got a significant head injury and severe hypothermia. We're doing everything we can for her, but the next few hours are going to be critical. Can you tell me what happened? How did she get hurt?" The question Jude had been dreading had finally arrived. For 2 years, he had practiced the lies that protected his family from outside interference. Ivy had fallen down the stairs. He had run into a door. Accidents happened to children all the time, and their family was just unlucky when it came to bumps and bruises. But sitting in the warm safety of the hospital, with medical professionals working to save his sister's life, the lies suddenly seemed inadequate and dangerous. What if the truth about Ivy's injuries could help the doctors treat her more effectively? What if the lies he had been taught to tell were actually preventing her from getting the best possible care? She hit her head, Jude said carefully, testing the waters with a partial truth. How did she hit her head? Dr. Hayes asked, her voice remaining gentle, but taking on a quality that suggested she was listening for more than just medical information. Jude hesitated, feeling the familiar weight of family loyalty and the fear of consequences that had kept him silent for so long. But then he thought about the journey through the storm, about how close he had come to losing Ivy completely, about how still and cold she had felt in his arms during those final desperate steps to the hospital. "Our stepfather," he whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal even as he spoke them. "Ray. He was drunk, and Ivy accidentally knocked over his beer, and he got really angry." Dr. Hayes stopped her examination, her full attention focused on Jude's face. "Your stepfather hit her?" "Not exactly," Jude said, trying to maintain some small shred of the protective lies that had become second nature. "She was trying to get away from him, and she fell and hit her head on the corner of the kitchen table. But Dr. Hayes had been working in emergency medicine long enough to recognize the signs of family violence, and she had examined too many children with suspicious injuries to be satisfied with partial explanations." "Jude," she said, sitting down in the chair beside his gurney so that they were at eye level, "I've been a doctor for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of children who have been hurt by adults who were supposed to protect them. I know how scary it can be to tell the truth about what happens at home. But right now, the most important thing is making sure that you and Ivy are safe." "We are safe," Jude protested automatically. "I mean, we will be when she gets better. Ray's not really a bad person. He just drinks too much sometimes. And when he drinks, he gets angry about things." Dr. Hayes nodded with the kind of understanding that made Jude feel like she had heard similar stories many times before. "Can you tell me about the other times Ivy has been hurt? I have her medical records here, and she's been to the emergency room 3 times in the past year." The weight of those visits, the carefully constructed lies, the fear of saying too much, the constant anxiety about protecting family secrets, suddenly felt crushing. Jude looked at Dr. Hayes's kind face and realized that she already knew most of the truth. She was not asking for information. She was giving him permission to stop carrying the burden of lies that had been placed on his shoulders by adults who should have been protecting him instead. "He calls them discipline sessions," Jude said quietly, the words coming out in a rush once he started speaking. "When we do something wrong, or when he thinks we're being disrespectful, or when he's been drinking and everything makes him angry. He says kids today don't understand consequences, and that's why they grow up to be worthless." Dr. Hayes listened without interruption, her expression remaining calm and professional, even as Jude described the escalating pattern of violence that had become their normal life. He told her about the times Ivy had been clumsy and fallen downstairs that did not exist in their trailer. He told her about his own accidents, running into doors, tripping over furniture, bumping into walls in ways that left bruises in the shape of adult hands. "Tonight was different," Jude continued, his voice becoming stronger as the relief of finally telling the truth overcame his fear of the consequences. "Usually he just hits us or pushes us around, but tonight he was really drunk, and when Ivy knocked over his beer, he grabbed her and she tried to get away, and that's when she hit the table." "And then what happened?" Dr. Hayes asked gently. "She wouldn't wake up," Jude said, his voice cracking as he remembered those terrifying hours in the trailer. "I tried everything, saying her name, shaking her shoulders, even tickling her feet like Mama does. But she just lay there, and there was blood in her hair, and she was breathing funny." "Where was your mother during all this?" "At work. She has to work double shifts at the diner to pay for everything. She doesn't know how bad Ray gets when she's not there." Dr. Hayes made notes on her clipboard, but her attention remained focused on Jude's face. "And Ray? Where was he when you decided to bring Ivy to the hospital?" "Passed out drunk in the bedroom," Jude said. "The phones weren't working because of the storm, and our neighbors lived too far away, and I knew Ivy was really hurt this time. So I put her on our sled and brought her here. The silence that followed was filled with the distant sounds of the hospital, machines beeping, staff calling to each other, the general hum of a medical facility in operation. Dr. Hayes sat quietly for several minutes, processing what Jude had told her and considering the implications for both children's safety. "Jude," she said finally, "you probably saved your sister's life tonight. The head injury she sustained could have been fatal if she hadn't received medical attention. But I need you to understand that what you've told me changes things. I'm required by law to report suspected child abuse to the authorities, which means that police and social services are going to become involved." The fear that Jude had been suppressing throughout his confession suddenly surged to the surface. "Are you going to take us away from Mama? She didn't do anything wrong. She works all the time to take care of us. It's not her fault that Ray drinks." "I don't know what's going to happen," Dr. Hayes said honestly. "That's not my decision to make. But I can promise you that the people who will be involved are trained to help families in situations like yours. Their job is to make sure that children are safe, and sometimes that means making changes that seem scary at first." A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Martinez, the pediatrician who had been called to examine Ivy, appeared in the doorway with an expression that made Jude's heart race with anxiety. "How is she?" Dr. Hayes asked, though her tone suggested she was preparing for difficult news. "Stable for now," Dr. Martinez replied. "The head injury resulted in a mild concussion and some swelling, but the CT scan doesn't show any evidence of brain damage. The hypothermia was more serious. Her core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, but we've been able to rewarm her gradually. She's responding to treatment." Jude felt a wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy. "Is she awake? Can I see her?" "She's still unconscious, but her vital signs are improving," Dr. Martinez said. "You can see her in a few minutes, but first, Detective Martinez from the Millbrook Police Department needs to speak with you." The detective was a woman in her 30s with short brown hair and a badge that caught the light when she moved. She introduced herself as someone who specialized in cases involving children, and her manner was professional but kind as she began asking questions about their home life. Jude found himself repeating much of what he had already told Dr. Hayes, but with more specific details about the pattern of abuse that had escalated over the past 2 years. Detective Martinez took careful notes and asked follow-up questions that helped her understand the full scope of the situation. "What you've told us is very helpful," she said when Jude finished his account. "Based on your statement and the medical evidence, we have grounds to arrest Ray Dunlap for child abuse. We're going to send officers to your trailer right now to take him into custody." "What about Mama?" Jude asked. "She doesn't know what happened. She's going to be so scared when she comes home and finds us gone." "We'll contact her at work and explain the situation," Detective Martinez assured him. "This isn't her fault, and no one is blaming her for what Ray did. But we do need to make sure that you and Ivy are safe while we sort everything out." The next hour passed in a blur of activity that left Jude feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. Social workers arrived to discuss temporary placement options. Hospital staff continued monitoring both children's conditions. Phone calls were made to their mother, to the police officers dispatched to arrest Ray, to the various agencies that would become involved in their case. Through it all, Dr. Hayes remained a constant presence, checking on Jude's recovery from hypothermia while coordinating his care with the other professionals who had suddenly become involved in his life. Her calm competence was reassuring in the midst of so much uncertainty and change. When they finally allowed Jude to see Ivy, she was awake but groggy, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by monitoring equipment and warming blankets. Her head was bandaged where she had hit the table, and she looked small and vulnerable in the adult-sized bed. But her eyes were open, and she managed a weak smile when she saw her brother. "Jude?" she whispered, her voice hoarse but recognizable. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand carefully. "You're going to be okay. The doctors fixed everything, and you're safe now." "Where are we?" "The hospital. Remember the story I used to tell you about the route to get here? I brought you here for real this time." Ivy's eyes widened slightly as fragmented memories began to return. In the storm? In the storm, Jude confirmed. But we made it. We're both safe now. A social worker named Miss Peterson, no relation to their elderly neighbor, arrived to explain what would happen next. Ray had been arrested without incident, still unconscious from his drinking binge. Their mother was on her way to the hospital, having been picked up from work by a police officer who had explained the situation during the drive. "You'll be staying in protective custody while we investigate the situation at home," Miss Peterson explained. "That means you'll be in a safe place with people who are trained to take care of children who have been through difficult experiences." "Together?" Jude asked, his grip tightening on Ivy's hand. "Together," Miss Peterson confirmed. "We understand how important it is for you to stay with each other." When their mother arrived an hour later, her face was streaked with tears and her hands were shaking as she gathered both children into her arms. Carla Mitchell was a thin woman in her early 30s who looked older than her years, worn down by the stress of working multiple jobs and trying to hold her family together under impossible circumstances. "I'm so sorry," she whispered over and over again. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm so sorry I didn't know how bad things had gotten. I'm so sorry I let him hurt you." Jude wanted to comfort his mother, to tell her that none of this was her fault, but he was too exhausted for complex explanations. Instead, he held on to both Ivy and his mother and let himself feel safe for the first time in 2 years. The confession, that had started with Dr. Hayes' gentle questions, had set in motion a series of events that would change their lives forever. Ray was in jail, facing charges that would likely keep him there for years. Their mother would have to answer difficult questions about her knowledge of the abuse and her ability to protect her children. But as Jude sat in the warm hospital room, holding his sister's hand while their mother stroked his hair, he knew that telling the truth had been the right choice. The lies that had protected their family's secrets had also trapped them in a cycle of violence that could have killed Ivy if he had not found the courage to speak up. The storm outside was finally beginning to subside, and through the hospital window, Jude could see the first hints of dawn breaking over Millbrook. It had been the longest night of his young life, but they had all survived it. Now it was time to begin the longer, more difficult journey of learning how to live without fear, how to trust adults to protect instead of harm them, and how to build a new kind of family based on safety and love instead of secrets and violence. The confession was complete, and for the first time in 2 years, Jude Mitchell could imagine a future where he was allowed to be a child instead of a guardian. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning when the first gentle snowflakes of winter began to fall over the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, Jude Mitchell stood at the kitchen window of his new home and watched the white crystals drift down from a gray sky like feathers from heaven itself. For a moment, just a brief, involuntary moment, his body tensed with the remembered terror of that night in February when snow had meant death and desperation, and a 4-mile journey through hell that had nearly claimed both his and Ivy's lives. The flashback hit him like a physical blow. The howling wind, the burning cold in his lungs, the terrifying weight of his unconscious sister in his arms as he stumbled through drifts that reached above his waist. His hands, which had been holding a warm mug of hot chocolate, began to tremble slightly as muscle memory recalled the agony of gripping a sled rope with frozen fingers while fighting through the worst blizzard Vermont had seen in a decade. But then he felt a warm, familiar hand on his shoulder, and Dr. Vivian Hayes, who was no longer just his doctor but officially his adoptive mother for the past 3 months, smiled down at him with the kind of patient understanding that came from months of careful healing and countless conversations about trauma and recovery and the long road back to feeling safe in the world. "Just snow," she said gently, using the phrase that had become their family's shorthand for moments when the past threatened to intrude on the present. "Just beautiful, normal snow that kids play in and build snowmen with and have snowball fights in. The kind of snow that's supposed to be fun." Jude nodded slowly, taking a deep breath and consciously letting the tension ease out of his shoulders. At 10 years old now, he was noticeably taller and healthier than he had been during those dark months in the trailer with Ray. His face had filled out with proper nutrition and the absence of constant stress, giving him the rounded cheeks and bright eyes that 10-year-olds were supposed to have. His hands, which had been frostbitten and scarred from gripping the sled rope through a killer blizzard, were now smooth and soft, devoted to activities like homework and soccer practice and the art projects that Vivian encouraged him to pursue. As a way of expressing emotions he still sometimes struggled to put into words. The house where they now lived was everything their trailer had not been. Warm and spacious and filled with the kind of ordinary family chaos that Jude had once thought existed only on television shows. There were bookshelves lining the walls, filled with everything from children's picture books to Nathan's collection of classic literature. There were family photographs in frames on the mantelpiece, including recent ones of Jude and Ivy at various family activities, soccer games, school plays, holiday celebrations where they were surrounded by adults who actually wanted them there. The kitchen where they stood was bright and welcoming, with yellow walls and white cabinets and a breakfast table that was large enough for the whole family to sit around comfortably. There were no wobbling legs propped up with phone books. No stains that could not be cleaned. No atmosphere of tension and fear that made every meal feel like a potential battleground. Instead, the kitchen was a place where they gathered for pancake breakfasts on Saturday mornings and homework help on school nights, and the kind of casual conversation that families were supposed to have. "Is Ivy ready?" Jude asked, though he could already hear his sister's excited chatter coming from the living room, where she was presumably putting on the winter gear that Vivian and Nathan had bought specifically for Vermont's harsh climate. "She's been ready since she woke up at 6:30 this morning," Vivian replied with a laugh that was full of genuine affection, rather than the strained amusement that their mother had sometimes managed during the worst days with Ray. Nathan had to physically stop her from putting on her snow gear at breakfast time. She was convinced that if she wasn't completely dressed and ready to go outside, the snow would somehow disappear before she could play in it. Nathan Hayes, Vivian's husband of 12 years, was a high school English teacher with infinite patience and a gift for making children feel valued and understood rather than tolerated or resented. He was a tall, gentle man with graying hair and kind eyes who had welcomed Jude and Ivy into their home with the same enthusiastic warmth he brought to everything else in his life. He had never once made them feel like burdens or complications, or children who were being imposed upon his previously peaceful household. Instead, he treated them as the gifts they had become, unexpected additions to his family who had enriched his life in ways he had never anticipated. The adoption process had been completed 3 months ago, after what had seemed like an endless series of legal procedures, home studies, psychological evaluations, and court hearings. There had been paperwork to fill out, interviews to conduct, and waiting periods that had stretched on forever, while lawyers and social workers and judges made sure that placing Jude and Ivy with the Hayes family was truly in their best interests. Throughout the entire process, Vivian and Nathan had been patient and understanding, never pressuring the children to make decisions they were not ready for, and always making it clear that they wanted to adopt them not out of pity or obligation, but because they had genuinely fallen in love with 2 remarkable children who deserved the kind of family that would never let them down. The finalization hearing had been held in a small courtroom in Burlington, with Judge Patricia Morrison presiding over a ceremony that was both legally binding and emotionally overwhelming. Jude had worn his first ever suit, purchased specifically for the occasion by Nathan, who had explained that some moments in life were important enough to dress up for. Ivy had worn a blue dress that matched her eyes, and she had carried the same stuffed rabbit that had been with her through all their darkest times. When Judge Morrison had declared that Jude and Ivy Mitchell were now officially Jude and Ivy Hayes, permanent members of a family that would never abandon them, or hurt them, or fail to protect them, there had not been a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the court reporter, who had presumably seen hundreds of similar proceedings, had wiped away tears as the newly formed family embraced in front of the judicial bench. Jude was no longer Jude Mitchell, the boy who had lived in constant fear of his stepfather's unpredictable violence and who had been forced to grow up too quickly in order to protect his sister from dangers that no child should ever have to face. He was now Jude Hayes, son of two adults who had chosen to love him and protect him and give him the childhood he had never been allowed to have. It was a transformation that went far deeper than a simple change of name. It was a fundamental shift in his identity and his understanding of what family was supposed to mean. Ivy bounded into the kitchen wearing her new winter coat, a bright pink parka with purple trim that actually fit her properly, purchased specifically for her by parents who considered her comfort and safety far more important than the cost of quality winter gear. At 7 years old, she had grown 3 inches and gained 12 pounds since that terrible February night, transforming from a frightened, undernourished child who flinched at sudden movements into a vibrant little girl who laughed easily and slept peacefully through the night without nightmares. Her blonde hair, which had been matted with blood and tangled from their journey through the storm, now hung in neat braids that Vivian had taught her to do herself as part of their morning routine. Her blue eyes, which had been too often filled with fear and confusion during their months with Ray, now sparkled with the kind of innocent excitement that 7-year-olds were supposed to feel about simple pleasures like snow days and family outings. "Jude, look how much snow there is already!" she exclaimed, pressing her face against the kitchen window beside him and leaving a small nose print on the glass. "Can we build a snowman? Can we make snow angels? Can we have a snowball fight? Can we go sledding on the hill behind the house?" The enthusiasm in her voice would have been impossible to imagine during their months in the trailer, when snow meant that Ray would be trapped inside with them, drinking heavily and looking for reasons to inflict his discipline sessions on children who had no escape and no protection. Back then, winter weather meant increased danger, longer periods of confinement with an increasingly volatile man, and the constant anxiety that came from never knowing what might trigger his next explosion. Now snow meant fun and family time, and the kind of innocent joy that every child deserved to experience. It meant building snowmen and having snowball fights and going sledding on the gentle hill behind their house, where the only danger was the possibility of tumbling harmlessly into a soft drift at the bottom. "We can do all of those things," Jude promised, ruffling her hair in the affectionate way that big brothers were supposed to do, protectively but playfully, without the desperate intensity that had characterized their relationship during the worst times. "But first we need to bundle up properly so we don't get cold. Remember what Vivian taught us about layering?" The transformation in their sibling relationship had been one of the most remarkable aspects of their recovery process. For 2 years, Jude had been forced to act as Ivy's protector and surrogate parent, carrying responsibilities that no 9-year-old should ever have to bear. He had been hypervigilant and constantly on guard, always ready to step between his sister and whatever danger Ray might present. The weight of keeping her safe had aged him prematurely, robbing him of his own childhood, while forcing him to develop survival skills that children should never need. Now, with real adults handling the serious business of keeping them safe and cared for, Jude was free to simply be her big brother in the normal, healthy way that siblings were supposed to relate to each other. He could tease her about her messy room and help her with homework, and teach her things like how to ride a bicycle and throw a baseball without feeling like her life depended on his constant protection. The change had not happened overnight. For months after they were placed with the Hayes family, Jude had continued to act as Ivy's primary caretaker, unable to trust that the adults around them would actually follow through on their promises to keep them safe. He would check on her multiple times during the night, making sure she was still breathing and still in her bed. He would position himself between her and any adult who approached her, ready to defend her from threats that no longer existed. It had taken patient work from both Vivian and Nathan, along with regular sessions with Dr. Sarah Chen, their family therapist, to help Jude understand that his job was no longer to protect his sister from the world. That responsibility now belonged to adults who were actually equipped to handle it, leaving him free to focus on the normal challenges of childhood, making friends, doing well in school, discovering his own interests and talents. Vivian and Nathan had both completed extensive training in trauma-informed parenting before the children were placed with them. They had learned about the long-term effects of child abuse, the complexities of attachment disorders, and the patience required to help children recover from experiences that should never have happened to anyone so young. They had been prepared for nightmares and behavioral problems, for attachment issues and trust difficulties, for the possibility that healing might take years rather than months. What they had not been prepared for was how fundamentally resilient and loving both children turned out to be. Despite everything they had endured, the violence, the neglect, the constant fear, the night when they had nearly died in a blizzard, Jude and Ivy had somehow retained their capacity for happiness, their ability to form healthy relationships, and their basic trust in the possibility that adults could be safe and protective, rather than dangerous and unpredictable. Dr. Chen had explained to them that children who survive trauma often develop what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the development of strengths and coping skills that actually make them more resilient than children who have never faced serious adversity. Jude and Ivy had both demonstrated this kind of growth, showing levels of empathy, emotional intelligence, and appreciation for safety and stability that were remarkable in children their age. The therapy sessions had been crucial to their healing process. Dr. Chen was a warm, patient woman in her 50s who specialized in childhood trauma recovery and had worked with hundreds of families affected by abuse and neglect. She had met with Jude and Ivy both individually and together, helping them process their experiences and develop healthy coping strategies for dealing with difficult emotions and traumatic memories. She had taught Jude that his actions on the night of the blizzard had been genuinely heroic, but that being a hero did not mean he had to carry adult responsibilities for the rest of his life. She had helped him understand that protecting his sister during their time with Ray had been necessary and admirable, but that continuing to act as her guardian when they were living with safe, competent adults was actually preventing both of them from developing the normal sibling relationship they deserved. With Ivy, Dr. Chen had focused on helping her understand that the violence she had experienced was never her fault, that children are never responsible for adult behavior, and that adults who hurt children are the ones with serious problems, not the children themselves. She had worked with Ivy to develop age-appropriate ways of expressing her feelings and to rebuild her basic sense of safety and trust in the world around her. The family therapy sessions had been equally important, helping all 4 members of their new family learn to communicate effectively and build the kind of healthy relationships that would support them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Vivian and Nathan had learned how to recognize signs of trauma responses in the children and how to provide the kind of patient, consistent support that would help them continue healing. Their birth mother, Carla, had also been part of the healing process, though in a more complicated and carefully managed way. She had undergone her own intensive therapy and counseling, working with specialists in domestic violence to understand how she had failed to protect her children and what she needed to do differently to ensure their safety in the future. The full court-mandated counseling had been difficult for Carla, forcing her to confront painful truths about her relationship with Ray and her own childhood experiences that had left her vulnerable to abusive men. She had attended weekly sessions for 6 months, participated in support groups for women who had been in abusive relationships, and completed a comprehensive domestic violence education program that taught her to recognize warning signs and develop safety plans. Only after completing all of these requirements had the court allowed her to have supervised visits with Jude and Ivy. Those early visits had been awkward and emotionally charged, filled with tears and apologies and the complicated emotions that come with rebuilding a relationship that had been severely damaged by trauma and neglect. Carla had struggled with feelings of guilt and shame about her failure to protect her children from Ray's violence. She had blamed herself for bringing him into their lives, for not recognizing the signs of escalating abuse, for being absent during the night when Ivy was so seriously injured. The children, meanwhile, had struggled with their own complex feelings about their mother. Love mixed with anger, forgiveness complicated by resentment, and the ongoing confusion about why she had not been able to keep them safe. But gradually, with the help of ongoing therapy and the patient support of the Hayes family, they had all learned to navigate these complicated relationships in a healthier way. Carla remained an important part of her children's lives, but now she was present as their birth mother and extended family member rather than their primary caretaker. It was an unconventional arrangement, but it worked for their particular family situation, allowing the children to maintain a connection with their biological parent while ensuring that their daily care remained in the hands of adults who had proven their ability to provide safety and stability. The visits with Carla had evolved from awkward, supervised meetings in a social services office to relaxed family gatherings that might include dinner at a restaurant or an afternoon at a local park. Carla had gotten her own apartment in Burlington and found steady work as a medical assistant, rebuilding her life with the same determination that her children had shown in rebuilding theirs. She was dating again, but this time she was applying the lessons she had learned in therapy, choosing men who respected her boundaries and understood that her children's safety was her top priority. Ray Dunlap, meanwhile, had become largely irrelevant to their daily lives. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to charges of child abuse, reckless endangerment, and assault. The prosecutor had argued for a longer sentence, pointing to the pattern of escalating violence and the near-fatal injuries that Ivy had sustained, but Ray's attorney had negotiated a plea deal that took into account his lack of prior convictions and his supposed willingness to undergo alcohol treatment while incarcerated. He would be eligible for parole in 3 years, but by then Jude and Ivy would be teenagers living in a stable home with parents who would never allow him to hurt them again. The restraining order that had been issued as part of his sentencing would remain in effect indefinitely, legally prohibiting him from having any contact with either child. Even if he managed to stay sober and convince a parole board that he was no longer dangerous, he would never again be allowed to be part of their lives. The man who had terrorized them for 2 years had become nothing more than a cautionary tale, a chapter in their past that was closed and locked away. Jude sometimes wondered what had happened to Ray in prison, whether he was getting the alcohol treatment he desperately needed, or simply serving his time while planning his next attempt to find someone vulnerable to control and abuse. But those thoughts came less frequently now, and when they did, they no longer carried the fear and anxiety that had once dominated his daily life. "Are you ready for our adventure?" Nathan asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his own winter coat and the kind of genuine smile that had made him a favorite teacher among his high school students for more than a decade. The adventure was a trip back to Millbrook to tea. Visit the town where they had lived through their darkest hours and nearly lost their lives during one terrible February night. It had been Nathan's idea, suggested during one of their family meetings as a way of helping the children see how much their lives had changed and how strong they had become in the months since their rescue. Vivian had been initially resistant to the plan, worried that returning to the scene of their trauma might trigger setbacks in their recovery or undo some of the progress they had made in therapy. She had expressed concerns about exposing the children to reminders of their abuse, and questioned whether such a visit was necessary for their healing process. But Dr. Chen had supported Nathan's suggestion, explaining that confronting the past from a position of safety and strength could be an important part of the recovery process for trauma survivors. She had pointed out that the children needed to see viscerally that they were no longer the frightened, helpless victims they had been 6 months ago. They needed to understand, in a way that went deeper than intellectual knowledge, that they had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to them, and had not only survived, but emerged stronger and more resilient on the other side. The trip had been planned carefully, with multiple backup plans in case either child found the experience too overwhelming. Dr. Chen had coached them on coping strategies they could use if difficult memories surfaced, and Vivian and Nathan had promised that they could leave immediately if either child felt uncomfortable or wanted to return home. But as they prepared to leave that morning, both children seemed genuinely excited about the expedition. For Ivy, who remembered very little of that February night due to her concussion, the trip was more like visiting a place she had heard about, in stories rather than confronting traumatic memories. For Jude, it represented an opportunity to prove to himself that the past no longer had the power to hurt him. The drive to Millbrook took them through countryside that was genuinely beautiful in its winter dress, with snow-covered fields stretching to the horizon and frost-covered trees that looked like something from a Christmas card. The landscape was peaceful and pristine, nothing like the howling chaos that Jude remembered from his desperate journey through the blizzard. He found himself studying the route they were taking, comparing it to the path he had followed that night while dragging Ivy on the sled. From the warmth and safety of Nathan's reliable car, with the heater running and cheerful music playing on the radio, it was hard to believe that this same terrain had nearly killed them both just 10 months earlier. Ivy chattered happily in the back seat, pointing out interesting sights and asking questions about everything they passed. She wanted to know why some fields had cows while others had horses, why some trees kept their leaves in winter while others were bare, and whether they might see any wild animals during their drive. Her curiosity and enthusiasm were infectious, filling the car with the kind of innocent wonder that made the adults smile and remember why they loved spending time with children. She had very few memories of most of that February night, her concussion, having mercifully erased much of the trauma of Ray's final violent outburst and the desperate journey through the storm. What she did remember came to her in fragments, flashes of being carried by her brother, glimpses of swirling snow, the sensation of being warm and safe after being very cold. For her, the story of how Jude had carried her 4 miles through a killer blizzard to save her life was almost like a fairy tale, something heroic and exciting rather than terrifying and desperate. Dr. Chen had explained that this kind of memory loss was common in cases of severe head trauma, particularly in young children whose brains were still developing. While it was possible that some memories might return as Ivy got older, it was more likely that her recollections of that night would remain fragmentary and emotionally neutral. In some ways, this was a blessing. She had been spared the kind of detailed traumatic memories that might have haunted her for years. Their first stop was Millbrook General Hospital, where they were greeted by several staff members who remembered their dramatic arrival 6 months earlier. The emergency room looked completely different in the bright light of a winter morning, bustling with ordinary medical activity rather than serving as the scene of desperate life-saving intervention that Jude remembered. Dr. Hayes, who was now simply Mom to both children, though they sometimes still slipped and called her by her professional title when they were talking about medical topics, gave them a tour of the treatment rooms where they had been cared for during those critical first hours. She showed them the equipment that had been used to warm them up after their exposure to the cold, the machines that had monitored their vital signs, and the supplies that had been used to treat Ivy's head injury. It was important for them to understand that they were survivors rather than victims, that they had overcome something extraordinary and lived to tell about it. The medical intervention that had saved their lives was presented not as something that had been done to them, but as something they had actively participated in by getting themselves to the hospital and cooperating with their treatment. "You were both so incredibly brave that night," Vivian told them, as they stood in the room where Jude had first confessed the truth about Ray's abuse and the pattern of violence that had characterized their home life. "Jude, your courage in bringing Ivy here through that storm was absolutely remarkable. Most adults would not have been able to do what you did. And Ivy, your strength in fighting through such serious injuries was truly inspiring. You're both heroes in the truest sense of the word." The hospital staff who had been on duty that night had nothing but praise for both children. They talked about Jude's determination and maturity, his obvious love for his sister, and his ability to provide crucial information about Ivy's injuries despite his own exhaustion and hypothermia. They praised Ivy's resilience and fighting spirit, noting that her recovery had been faster and more complete than anyone had dared to hope. Several nurses mentioned that they had followed the children's progress through Vivian, and they expressed genuine happiness about the adoption and the new life that both children were building. It was clear that their story had touched everyone who had been involved in their care, serving as a reminder of why they had chosen careers dedicated to helping people in their most vulnerable moments. From the hospital, they drove through downtown Millbrook, past all the landmarks that had guided Jude during his desperate journey through the storm. Miller's Hardware with its red sign, still creaking slightly in the winter wind. The post office with its American flag, still flying proudly despite the gently falling snow. The Congregational Church with its tall white steeple, still serving as a beacon for travelers trying to find their way through the small town. But now these familiar buildings looked completely different to Jude, transformed from desperate waypoints in a life-or-death struggle into ordinary small-town establishments where normal people lived and worked and went about their daily business. The terror and desperation he had felt that night were gone, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment and the knowledge that he had done something truly extraordinary when extraordinary action was required. Nathan parked the car near the church, and they all got out to walk around the downtown area that had been the final stretch of Jude's journey to save his sister. The snow was falling more heavily now, but it was the gentle, peaceful kind of snowfall that made everything look clean and beautiful, rather than the violent, wind-driven storm that had nearly killed them both. Ivy ran ahead, delighting in the way her footprints left perfect impressions in the fresh snow. She had no memory of stumbling through these same streets while unconscious in her brother's arms, and to her they were simply interesting places to explore on a snowy day with her family. Jude walked more slowly, taking time to really look at each building and compare his current experience with his memories of that desperate night. The streetlights that had provided crucial navigation guidance now seemed ordinary and unremarkable. The doorways where he had sheltered during brief rest stops now looked like simple architectural features rather than life-saving refuges. "How does it feel?" Vivian asked gently, falling into step beside him as they approached the final stretch of Main Street that led to the hospital. "Smaller," Jude replied thoughtfully. "Everything looks so much smaller than I remember. That night, it felt like the distance between buildings was huge, like I was never going to make it from one streetlight to the next. But now I can see that it's really not that far. Things often seem bigger and more threatening when we're scared," Nathan observed, joining their conversation. "When you're fighting for your life and carrying someone you love, every obstacle becomes magnified. The fact that you made it through all of this while dealing with that level of fear makes what you did even more impressive." Their final stop was the most emotionally challenging one. Nathan drove them out Maple Ridge Road to the trailer park, where they had lived through 2 years of fear and violence, where their childhood had been stolen by an adult who was supposed to protect them rather than harm them. The trailer itself was gone, removed by the landlord after being condemned by housing inspectors who had found multiple safety violations that had been ignored for years. The electrical system had been dangerously overloaded, the heating system had carbon monoxide leaks, and the structure itself had been compromised by water damage and poor maintenance. It was a miracle, the inspector had noted in his report, that the family had not been killed by the unsafe living conditions, even before the night of Ray's final violent outburst. In place of their former home was simply an empty lot with a few concrete blocks and some scattered debris to mark where the trailer had once stood. The space looked impossibly small to have contained all the fear and violence that had dominated their lives for so long. Without the trailer itself, it was just another patch of ground that would probably be covered with wildflowers when spring arrived. Jude stood in the gently falling snow looking at the empty space where the worst chapter of his life had unfolded, and he felt nothing but relief. The place that had haunted his dreams for months was gone, erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. There was no longer any physical reminder of the cramped, cold trailer where they had lived in constant fear of Ray's unpredictable violence. "How does it feel?" Vivian asked again, standing beside him with one arm around his shoulders and the other around Ivy. "Like it's really over," Jude replied, and he was surprised to realize how completely he meant it. Like it happened to someone else a very long time ago. Like it was just a bad dream that I've finally woken up from. Ivy had wandered over to examine the old oak tree that had stood 20 feet from their front door, the same tree that had been barely visible through the swirling snow that terrible night. Now, it was just a tree, stripped of any threatening associations, its bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like arms raised in celebration of survival. "This is where we used to live?" she asked, though she showed no signs of distress or traumatic memories. To her, it was simply an empty lot that happened to be part of her family's history. "This is where we used to live," Jude confirmed. "But that's over now. We live somewhere much better, with people who actually love us and want to take care of us." "Can we go home now?" Ivy asked, and the simple word home carried all the weight of their transformation. Home was no longer a place of fear and secrets and violence. Home was the warm house where Vivian and Nathan were waiting with hot chocolate and dinner plans and the kind of ordinary family life that had once seemed like an impossible dream. The drive back to their real home took them through more beautiful winter scenery. But now Jude was looking forward rather than backward, thinking about the homework he needed to finish, and the soccer practice he had scheduled for tomorrow, and the Christmas presents he was planning to make for his new family. When they arrived at the Hayes house, which had officially become the Mitchell-Hayes house when the adoption was finalized, the first thing they did was change into their snow clothes and head out to the backyard for the snowman building project that Ivy had been planning since she first saw the snowflakes that morning. Nathan helped them roll the large bottom ball while Vivian gathered sticks for arms and stones for buttons. It was the kind of completely ordinary family activity that Jude had seen other families doing in movies and television shows but had never experienced himself, and he found himself marveling at how normal and wonderful it felt to be part of something so simple and happy. As they worked together in the gently falling snow, building something beautiful and fun rather than struggling, for survival, Jude realized that this was what healing actually looked like. Not a dramatic moment of revelation or recovery, not a single breakthrough that erased all the pain of the past, but rather the quiet accumulation of ordinary happy moments that gradually replaced the memories of fear and trauma. The snowman they were building together was not just a fun winter project. It was a symbol of everything they had gained and everything they would never lose again. It represented the security of having adults who participated in childhood activities rather than adults who saw children as burdens to be controlled or eliminated. It represented the luxury of being able to play in the snow instead of fighting through it for their lives. When the snowman was finally finished, complete with Nathan's old red scarf and a carrot nose that Ivy had insisted upon, they all stood back to admire their work. The snow was still falling gently, covering their creation with a fresh layer of white that made it look magical in the late afternoon light filtering through the clouds. "He looks happy," Ivy declared with satisfaction, clapping her mittened hands together, "like he's really glad to be here in our yard." "We're all glad to be here," Vivian said, pulling both children into a warm group hug that smelled like winter air and safety, and the kind of unconditional love that asked for nothing in return except the chance to keep them safe and help them grow into the people they were meant to become. As they headed inside for the hot chocolate and dinner that awaited them, Jude took one last look at their snowman standing guard in the backyard like a cheerful sentinel. 6 months ago, snow had been the enemy, a killer force that had nearly claimed both their lives during a desperate journey to find help when no other options remained. Tonight, snow was just snow, beautiful and fun and innocent, the way it was supposed to be for children who were allowed to be children. The transformation was complete and permanent. The boy who had carried his dying sister 4 miles through a blizzard had become a 10-year-old who built snowmen with his parents and worried about normal things like math tests and whether his soccer team would make the playoffs this year. The girl who had nearly died from her stepfather's violence had become a 7-year-old who believed in the magic of snow and the permanence of love and the possibility that families could be safe and happy. They had survived the storm, both the literal blizzard that had nearly killed them and the metaphorical storm of abuse and trauma that had defined their early lives. They had found their way to safety, not just that one February night, but permanently, finally, completely. They had learned that survival was not enough. What mattered was building a life worth living once survival was no longer in question. As Jude sat in the warm kitchen drinking hot chocolate and listening to Ivy chatter excitedly about their snowman building adventure and their plans for tomorrow's snow angels, he realized that this was what happily ever after actually looked like in real life. Not a fairy tale ending where all problems disappeared forever and nothing bad ever happened again, but rather a genuine transformation where love and safety and ordinary family happiness had permanently replaced fear and violence and the terrible burden of trying to protect someone you loved from dangers you were too small to fight alone. The snow continued to fall outside their kitchen window, but now it was just snow, beautiful and harmless, and full of infinite possibilities for joy and play, and the kind of innocent childhood experiences that every child deserved to have. The storm was over, and they were home, and they were safe, and they were loved, and that was everything that mattered in the world.